Hi, this is the Bible Touchstone, and this is my fourth response to Swenner64. Was Matthew chapter 24 fulfilled in AD 70? And so we're going over particular claims from his argument and testing whether they're actually backed up with scripture, consistent with his argument and his thesis. And he's a partial preterist that says that Matthew chapter 24 records a different sermon with different central theme than Luke chapter 21. So he says Luke chapter 21 was fulfilled because it was only indicative of the first century events which happened, which were fulfilled in that generation, like Jesus said they would happen in Luke chapter 21. But Matthew chapter 24 and Mark chapter 13, those are still future to come. So one of the appeals he gives is that Great Tribulation hasn't happened. He says Great Tribulation is the focus is on Christians. And once again, I'm saying that Swenner64 is in a big denial about the verity of persecution in the first century. He says that the persecution under Diocletian was much worse than that that the Christians faced in the first century when they were being beheaded for a testimony of Jesus Christ. And for example, Matthew chapter 24, verse 16, and I'll read to 21, it says, Let them that which be in Judea flee into the mountains, let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe to him that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, but pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for when shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. So, obviously, when he says in Luke chapter 21, if that was fulfilled, and that shows that the Christians were, as he says, exempt from judgment, one place he says that, Swenner says, Christians didn't face this great tribulation, but in Matthew chapter 24, he says the Great Tribulation has nothing to do with the Christians fleeing into the mountains from Judea, but even though it's contextually shown as a parallel here in Matthew chapter 24 with that Great Tribulation, it's being terribly inconsistent here. And for example, Matthew chapter 13, verse 9, it talks about how they would be delivered up into councils, and in the synagogues they would be beaten, and brought before rulers and kings for Christ's sake for testimony against them. Now, Swenner says that Diocletian's persecution was much greater than what they would have faced in the first century. As I'm saying, is described in Mark chapter 13, verse 9, when they would be beaten and all that, and especially beheaded for a testimony of Jesus Christ and martyred, which many Christian saints were martyred in the first century. Now, was Diocletian's persecution greater? Well, I don't want to limit the persecution of the Christians to this great tribulation, even though Swenner has divorced from that idea and relating it to the Great Tribulation, and it's shown to be part of the context here in Matthew chapter 24. The fact the temple was destroyed in part of this, and the end of the old covenant, much more is at stake here than a mere physical fulfillment or a mere physical persecution of the saints, because connected with the beheading of the first century saints and their martyrdom was the resurrection of the dead and the judgment of Jesus Christ upon all. So much more is at stake here than just AD 70 or Jerusalem. Also, he says, the sign of the day of the Lord and cataclysmic signs in the sun and the moon never happened in the first century. Matthew chapter 24, verse 29 and 30, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now, this Apocalyptic imagery we see throughout the Old Testament is indicative of national judgments against physical nations. For example, it's called the burden of Babylon in Isaiah chapter 13 and Isaiah chapter 14. King of Babylon is shown to be prophesied an oracle to him again as falling from heaven as a star. Isaiah chapter 30 shows national judgments that are associated with Egypt and Assyria. Isaiah chapter 34 talks about uh, national judgment of Edom. For example, it says in verse 4, "And all the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their hosts shall fall down as a leaf falleth from the vine." So it's going to be real easy to refute Swenner because he says everything in Luke chapter 21, all those things were fulfilled in that generation. Well, it says in Luke chapter 21, verse 25, "And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth, distress of nations, with perplexity as the seas and the waves roaring." So he says, and the focus of that is Jerusalem, and physical judgment against Jerusalem. Like Judah is said to be judged using this kind of imagery in Jeremiah 4, verses 23 through 28, and Egypt in Ezekiel chapter 32, verses 7 and 8, even though it's national judgment in Luke chapter 21, since, according to Swenner64, the main thesis or the focus, the central theme of Matthew chapter 24 is something totally different, that it must refer to physical heaven and earth, and the stars actually falling from the sky and stuff like that. It's going to show the proclivity of Swenner64's partial preterist inconsistency when dealing with Matthew chapter 24. Also, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven was seen is seen as the destruction of Jerusalem, or the destruction of the temple too. It's the sign of the Son of Man that's seen from heaven, because the Son of Man has already ascended in heaven, and there he is above all creation, master of the whole universe, and all are put under his footstool. He's not going to lower himself from the right hand of God till all be put under him, where he would be subordinate to the one that gave him that power, that's God the Father. And in Luke chapter 21, verse 27, it says, "And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory." Now, I mentioned this in my first video to Swenner64. If Luke chapter 21 was fulfilled, then how is it you could pass over verses like this that are contextually denoted to be fulfilled within that generation, and then turn around and liberalize your hermeneutic and say Matthew chapter 24, even though it shares the same content, is not a parallel and must be a different sermon? So I'm admonishing Swenner64 because of his inconsistency in hermeneutical liberalism with these passages. It's one thing to say that this generation refers to some other generation than the contemporary one that Jesus spoke in, but it's another thing to say that Luke chapter 24, or chapter 21 rather, is a different central theme and a different sermon than Matthew chapter 24. That is one of the biggest absurdities to present a partial preterist case that I've ever seen, and it's probably the most inconsistent case for partial preterism that I've ever seen either. So I think he should publicly address this and take back his position, or at least maintain some consistency and say Luke chapter 21 wasn't fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem and the physical judgment of Jerusalem, Israel, and the temple. As always, grace be to you.